Ladies and gentlemen, in his excellent book, America in the World, Bob Zoellick, former U.S. Trade Representative and World Bank President, suggests that if the U.S. gets its relationship right in the Americas, just about everything else falls into place. That's especially true with U.S.-Canada relations and the closeness between our two countries. Canada, since 2021, is the United States' largest trading partner. Canada is a steadfast ally that has stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. on some of the world's great challenges. And of course, today's topic, fostering cooperation between the U.S. and Canada to advance our national security and economic strength, is particularly timely. As they like to say in the media biz, torn from this week's headlines, a Chinese balloon passed over both of our countries, violating our airspace. It served as a vivid reminder of our shared interests and the important tools that we have of national and international, especially continental security, NORAD, the Canadian Joint Operations Command, and the U.S. Northern Command. There's a lot we don't know yet about the incident, but one thing is very clear. Canada is a full partner with the United States. Our moderator today is Canada Institute Director Chris Sands. Under Chris's leadership, the Institute is truly dedicated to raising the baseline level of knowledge of Canada in the United States in general and Washington, D.C. in particular. Our two countries are close, not just geographically, historically, culturally, and sometimes I think that causes us to overlook the obvious, that our futures are intertwined. Chris will facilitate a discussion that will cover all of those issues and that intertwined future. And we have two very distinguished guests with us to lead that conversation. The Honorable Anita Anand is Canada's Minister of National Defence and the Minister of Parliament for Oakville, Ontario, since 2019. She previously served in the Cabinet as Minister of Public Service and Procurement. Joining Minister Anand is the Honorable François-Philippe Champagne, Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry and the Member of Parliament for St. Maurice-Champlain in Quebec. He previously served as Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, and Minister of International Trade. It's obvious that our two guests bring a wealth of knowledge to topics that matter to both countries, not just right now, but for the rapidly emerging challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And as Bob Zoellick suggested, if we work together to get this right, so much will fall into place for both countries. Welcome, ministers. It is great to have you. And Chris, now over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I have to say, your leadership has made it easy to do Canada here because you support us so much, and I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate our guests today. So you've heard them introduced. I want to start with you, Minister Anand. You've had an amazing, for an academic, law professor, you've had an amazing career. When you were Minister of Procurement, you were figuring out how to deal with COVID, find PPE, find vaccines. Then you go to defense. And at defense, I made the list here. You only took over the portfolio in October 2021, and you have since secured $8 billion more of defense spending. You have recommitted to NORAD modernization and kept that on track, which is huge. You have an Indo-Pacific strategy that anticipates a more robust military activity in the Indo-Pacific, including partnering with Japan and South Korea, sort of a North Pacific strategy, but also 3 frigates that can be permanently stationed out there, which is impressive. And you got the F-35 actually finally purchased, which is a Gordian knot for those of you who don't follow this, and she really solved that. With all of that achievement behind you, what's your message here, and how do you want to approach the Canada-U.S. relationship?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us here today. We're just thrilled to be able to have a conversation with everyone in the audience today. And I'll just say that, as you mentioned, I was an academic before entering politics. I sometimes am very nostalgic for those days. But I will say that during that time, I did come to the Wilson Center as an academic. So it's great to be back, and it's great to have a conversation with everyone today. You know, part of what brings us here today is really the interconnected nature of our economies and our defense relationship. And François-Philippe and I sit together in the House of Commons, and when the heckling gets too much, we tend to revert to the items that really interest us, which is ensuring that we have resilient supply chains, because our economic prosperity is dependent upon our national security. So from that standpoint, I have also been very closely aligned with Secretary Austin, whom I'll be speaking with a little later on today. And on a number of items, including some of the ones you mentioned, we are working very closely to ensure that we are delivering. So, for example, military aid to Ukraine. That has been obviously at the top of all defense ministers and indeed leaders' minds over the past year, at least. But it's important to note that Canada actually has been present in Ukraine, training Ukrainian soldiers since 2015. We've trained over 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers since that time. And so what brings me here today is really to ensure the resiliency of the binational supply chains, but also to speak for the importance of Canadian businesses in a time when we need to ensure that as allies we rely on each other because of the changing global strategic environment. And so from a defense perspective, from a supply chain perspective, we've been meeting with suppliers in the defense area. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight once again the F-35 announcement that I made earlier in January for the purchase of 88 future fighters for Canada. But why that's important for Canadian suppliers isn't just because of the 88 future fighters themselves, but in terms of the global fleet that Lockheed Martin is producing, about 3,100 aircraft. Canadian suppliers are going to be producing parts for those 3,100 planes. And that just shows you the integrated nature of the supply chain across the border. And what we want to do here today is stress the importance of that relationship across a number of dimensions: the economic dimension, the defense dimension, and of course, supply chains writ large.
That's fantastic. Minister Champagne, I have to say, you also were part of this huge achievement, realigning Canada very much so that the industrial base is part of our defense industrial base. And just in the last couple of months, you've rolled out a consultation on competition policy. You've also talked about an innovation center that will think about commercialization so that we aren't just talking about defense, but taking the benefits and the spin-offs of defense and putting them into making our domestic economy prosperous. How do you see the challenges ahead of us on the Canada-U.S. supply chain, and what could we be doing better?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. It's my first time at the Wilson Center, and I just want to say to the director, I had better chance of keeping my job in the private sector. I know you outlined all the roles I had in the public sector, but trust me, I had the same job for a number of years before entering politics. But I would say, Chris, it brings all of it together, because today, when I was with Minister Anand, you know, national security and economic security are kind of going hand in hand in the world we're living today. I mean, if there was a time after the fall of the Berlin Wall that we were feeling we're going all in the same direction, the same boat, we realized today that there was actors in this world which were not intending to be with us on the same journey. And I think it's evident by recent events now, and we're seeing the time has kind of accelerated, and you see like global supply chain becoming more regional, more emphasis on resiliency than pure efficiency. And I think it plays to Canada. And we came on the back end. And I just want to say, Chris, you should be proud, because I think it's a first. We've been trying to look at folks at the embassy, but it's the first where you have a Minister of Defense and a Minister of Industry coming to Washington. And I think it's about time, let's be honest, because our mission today is, and what I've been saying to our American friends many times, is that Canada can play a key role in the resiliency of supply chain in America. And on the back of a State of the Union address and and the IRA, and I would say the CHIPS Act, when I talk to my good friend, Secretary Raimondo, what I say what's underlying all that is resiliency. And I think we have a key role in doing that because I keep saying Canada has what the economy of the 21st century need, mainly critical mineral, talent, renewable energy, access to market, key technologies, and I think even my US friends would agree we have a head start when it comes to AI, quantum, and cyber. Yesterday, we were just visiting a cybersecurity center. So I think that there's never been a better time. At a time where CEOs are trying to realign their supply chain a bit more with values and certainly more predictability and stability. You know, when you are in an uncertain times and challenges, and I'm sure Minister Anand can talk about that. I mean, we're seeing challenges left and right coming. A partner which provides you that stability, predictability, and the rule of law, I'd say is in high demand and short supply in the world. And in a world like that, that's why you need to double down on Canada, I would say, when you're looking at that. So what I've been trying to do in the message we bring to Washington, I look at the very successful corridor we have, for example, on the auto sector since the auto pact, the Windsor-Detroit, which is probably the third largest corridor in the world to manufacture car after what you see in China and perhaps in Germany. I launched the idea, and Sébastien Lemire, my good friend from the block in the House, would love that. We say, why don't we have something similar on semiconductors, where we can link Albany and Bromont so that we are more resilient, because it's one thing for the U.S. to increase production of semiconductor, but something you may not know and our colleagues may not appreciate fully is that most of the packaging and testing, the last part of semiconductor, is done by IBM in Bromont in Quebec. And so if we want to be more resilient, why don't we build that corridor? And now what we did with Minister Anand is to go to see some of the largest aerospace and defense companies, whether it's Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, is to say, why don't we build these very successful corridors? We have a number of these corridors which are very successful. And as we're looking at that, you know, how can we make sure that we innovate more together, we build more together, and we sell more together to the rest of the world? At a time where the world is looking, and you're seeing that, and I think Secretary Yellen talked about French shoring. I think for me, it's kind of continental shoring in a sense that we see the way to be resilient is to do more together. So I am delighted to be here with Minister Anand because it sends a very powerful signal that when you have the Minister of Industry and Defense come to Washington, we mean business. And I think this was well understood by everyone we met.
And to be clear, from a supply chain perspective, we have relationships with these firms. The key is that we need to ensure stability in our relationships with defense suppliers in the short and the long term. And that means, especially in this time where demand for product outstrips supply, to some extent because of the conflict in Ukraine, these relationships with industry are first and foremost fundamental to survivability and to our continued interoperability with our allies.
And I know this is maybe a historic first, but we were closely cooperating in both World War I and World War II, supplying the Europeans then as well. So there's a long history of this kind of defense industrial base sharing, which is important. Ambassador Green mentioned the China balloon, which is sort of in the news this week, and he did acknowledge.
But just a bit.
Yeah, just a bit. It's sailing over our heads. But from your perspective, was Ambassador Green right? Was there really good cooperation between Canada and the United States as the balloon went from Alaska over Canadian territory into the U.S.? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's fundamentally important to recognize that NORAD is the only binational command in the world.
Yep.
And it has been around for about 40 years. And our intention is to continue to ensure that it has that longevity. And nowhere is this more clear than over the past week in terms of what we saw with the balloon, because the information that we were analyzing at every moment was flowing to both governments through the NORAD binational command. And together with the United States through NORAD, we were analyzing, we were tracking the trajectory of the balloon and making decisions together as two countries must and should. And so what does it mean? What does it highlight? It highlights that the longevity of continental defense through NORAD is of the utmost importance. And in fact, it didn't take the balloon to make us recognize this. Obviously, last June, we announced that we would be spending almost $40 billion on upgrading our continental defense and modernizing NORAD, which will include building a northern approaches surveillance system to eventually replace the North Warning System, to ensure that we have the state-of-the-art radar systems that are necessary in these times. And so from a command and control perspective, from a defense research perspective, modernizing NORAD is going to be absolutely fundamental. So the balloon incident really just further highlighted the importance of NORAD as a binational command.
That was a fantastic illustration. Minister Champagne, I want to come back to China with you because you made headlines pretty much worldwide by ordering...
Happens from time to time.
Well, this was a big one. My phone blew up in the morning when you ordered the divestiture of Chinese interest in 3 critical minerals companies. Can you talk a little bit about that and also about critical minerals, which is something we've been hearing Canada has a lot, the U.S. has a lot. How do we get those into the market?
Yeah, and just to go back to your previous question, I was thinking about CDR when you talk about the Second World War. I'm very inspired. The building is called CDR. When every morning I walk, in terms of, we see generational opportunities, and you really, when you walk in the building, you're inspired because you say, this is the kind of opportunity about realigning our supply chain, more resiliency. And I'll come to your question, but I just want to say an anecdote. When Minister Anand was Minister of Procurement, I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, we lived through the tsunami of COVID. And I remember at the time talking with our U.S. colleagues, that was Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State, and colleagues, Dominic Raab in the UK. We said, it's quite astonishing that we've been investing billions in vaccine research, and yet we were all scrambling. And we said, how can we, better organize ourselves in terms of supply chain so we are more resilient, not for next year, but for the 20, 30 years to come. And obviously semiconductors and critical minerals were key to that, because if you look at today, what would be the vulnerability is around critical minerals. Why? Because the critical minerals are essential for the electric cars that we're all going to be driving one day, but also for semiconductors. So that's why Canada, when I say Canada is key to the resilience of supply chain in America, you can see. And I would say, when you talk to CEOs around the world, the word that comes all the time is proximity. Proximity to resources, proximity to market, proximity to assembly lines. And that's why Canada-U.S., we have to realize, and I said, you said it well, I think as the director, is that we kind of take each other for granted because these supply chains are so integrated that we fail oftentimes to appreciate them. But I can tell you the world is looking at that because this is the most integrated, the $2 billion a day, we know it in Canada, the fact that we buy more from the US than China, Japan, and UK combined, 2/3 of the United States have Canada as their first place of trading. But that makes a lot of sense. And to your point, when I took that decision at the time to block 3 transactions of Chinese interest trying to buy a lithium mine in Canada, it just means one message is that we are engaging with eyes wide open. Mm-hmm. We're working very closely with our friends in the intelligence agencies to make sure that we will protect our natural resources and we will protect our national interests. Because going back to why it's so relevant that Minister Anand and I are here is the nexus that you see more and more between national security and economic security. And economic prosperity, I would say, because with security comes prosperity. And I think you saw me taking a very hard stance, and I will do it again, because I think that we need to make sure, and I think Secretary Yellen said about friendshoring, you could say there's many ways you can refer to that, but one thing is clear is that for me, we need to really think strategically with our allies. We had the Chancellor of Germany come recently. We had the President of Korea. We had the Prime Minister of Japan. And I think with our allies, whether it's Japan, South Korea, our friends in Europe, like I said, when you talk to leaders around the world today, there's 3 things which is top of mind. And I would say anyone, at least that I've talked to, really realize that. It's food security, energy security, and supply chain resiliency. And that is driving a lot of what you're seeing around the world. And that's why the work of Minister Anand is so critical our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. Because you think about food security, energy security, that's really top of mind. So we are at an inflection point where I think we need to make sure that we are eyes wide open, that we modernize also. I mean, Minister Anand knows that very well from our previous work. We're now also modernizing the Investment in Canada Act to make sure that we'd be more nimble, we're more agile. Why? Because we see some actors, state and non-state actors, trying to be outsmarting sometimes our democracies in ways that we need to protect against. And I think the decision we took, whether it's on 5G when it came to Huawei, the decision we're taking now with respect to trying to take over lithium mines, I think that you're seeing our Five Eyes partner, and generally I think our trading partners, to really come to terms with that. And I think this is a good thing, because we know that we have what we're going to need to be ensuring prosperity for decades to come. So we need to make sure that we deal with that in the appropriate manner.
Fantastic.
And so if I could just add one or two more sentences
Sure.
on that. When we talk about being eyes wide open on China, it's not geographically limited to the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, that is the focus of a lot of our activity in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but it really means that we need to be cognizant, eyes wide open, in terms of our own geographical location, our own critical minerals, our own waterways and seaways, especially in the Arctic, as well as in the Indo-Pacific. And again, we are here in the United States to stress the importance of our economic relationship as a means to also ensuring national security.
Well, I want to pick up on that and keep the focus on you, Minister Anand. One of the biggest challenges we're facing is Ukraine, and both supplying Ukrainians today and training them, but also over the horizon, hopefully, post-conflict reconstruction. It'll take a lot to rebuild the country, and I know when Secretary Blinken was in Canada, he looked to Canada and said he was hoping Canada will play a big role in the reconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about Ukraine and what Canada's doing and what you see coming over the horizon that we should be doing together?
Okay, sure. Let me just paint the picture of our current aid for Ukraine. And I break it down into, as any good academic does, 3 parts. So firstly, on training, I mentioned already we've trained over 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers since 2015. That training is actually continuing. We're training Ukrainian soldiers in England, and we are training Ukrainian engineers in Poland. And we are have also trained Ukrainian soldiers on the M777s, and we will be training them on the Leopard 2A4 tanks that we are sending to Poland. So it's a very comprehensive examination of training, generally speaking, and I think there's an understanding that the Canadian Armed Forces has significant expertise in the area of training, and in particular, training Ukrainian Armed Forces. So that's the first prong of our aid, and that will continue under Operation Unifier, which we expanded and extended in January 2022. And then the second prong is our military aid and equipment, which we've put on the table over $1 billion of military aid since the beginning of the conflict, the further invasion. That has actually benefited, our aid has actually benefited from our relationship with the United States. So, for example, we purchased a NASAMS, ground air defense system, missile system, from the United States for about $400 million Canadian recently. And the opportunity for us to make that purchase emerged from person-to-person conversations we were having, that I was having with Secretary Austin. So the closeness of the relationship has actually led to very tangible results in terms of military aid for Ukraine. We also purchased artillery for the M777s for Ukraine from the United States. So we'll keep continuing to examine ways that we can be very helpful, leverage our relationship with industry, with our allies, and participate in the Defense Contact Group that Secretary Austin has so incredibly led a group of over 50 countries. We're getting together next week in Belgium, in fact. So that's been a really important part of our aid, as well as the training. And then the third prong is the transportation of military aid. And this sometimes goes unnoticed, but I will say we have about 50 Canadian Armed Forces members and 3 CC-130s over in Prestwick, Scotland, that have transported over 6 million pounds of military aid on behalf of our allies. So when I'm in Belgium at NATO, for example, I will frequently have our allies thanking Canada for the work it's doing in transporting aid, going into various countries, picking up aid and delivering it to Ukraine. So those three prongs are super important for us. We'll keep going in this area. And as a country, of course, whether it is in the area of humanitarian aid or economic aid, we'll continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. We have over 1.3 million Ukrainians in Canada, so a very large Ukrainian diaspora. We've welcomed many Ukrainian immigrants since the further invasion began, and have developed bridges, immigration bridges, for them to come to our country. So this is an across-the-board governmental effort, not just in the military area. We've put on the table over $5 billion of aid across humanitarian, economic, and military aid, and we'll just keep going because we believe so strongly, as does the United States, in the sovereignty of Ukraine and what that means for the rules-based international order. Mm-hmm. And the way I tend to think about it is that Ukraine's fight for its democracy is really the world's fight for the rules-based international order that has kept us safe since the end of the Second World War.
Amazing, amazing. I like two things of that. One, you can't emphasize enough that Canadians, because they have so many Ukrainian speakers, after Ukraine itself and Russia, I think you're the third largest set of Ukrainian speakers. We talk about training, especially for people who are not, maybe just picked up a rifle after the invasion, they're trying to defend their homeland, the ability to train them in Ukrainian has got to be a huge benefit.
Well, you know what? In my first call with Secretary Austin, almost the first point that he made to me was on the Canadian Armed Forces training that we have done in Ukraine, that it is globally recognized and considered to be so important for not just the relationships between the two countries, but for the expertise. And I will say that the Canadian Armed Forces themselves say that they've learned so much from Ukrainian soldiers about battlefield techniques. So it's a reciprocal relationship.
Absolutely. And I also like the logistic point, Canada delivers. That's a good slogan. Almost.
I love that. That's a good sales thing. We deliver. No, but I think Minister Anand said many, many things which are important, but defending the rule-based order has provided stability, predictability, but also prosperity. Mm-hmm. And the moment you challenge that, I think many nations in the world need to think, what does that mean to them? That's why this is not just Ukrainians' fight. It's all of our fight, because the moment that the rule-based order is not going to stand anymore, or that anyone in the world believes that we're not going to stand together to defend it, I think it's a spiral down, and we need to really engage, and that's why Canada and Minister Anand has been chiefly so engaged in that, and I think the world noticed it, and we need to be very cognizant that there is a I've heard, I think, was it Jan Stoltenberg said recently, yes, we may pay with dollars in the way our contribution, but these people pay with lives. And so the least we can do is to be there to support. And I think it's remarkable what Canada has been doing, punching above its weight the way I'm not sure everyone realized everything that Minister Anand said in terms of the logistics, and there's many ways to contribute. I remember when I was foreign minister, people often look at different things, but I would say these things which are enablers are very significant in the battlefield. And so that's why I think colleagues and I'd say allies recognize the role of Canada.
Well, I want to follow up on that, because one of the interesting things is if we pull away from China, the little bit of decoupling we sometimes say here, we're adding to cost. And at a time of inflation, what do we need to do to squeeze productivity out of that supply chain to get not just resilience, but higher efficiency and performance so that we can be competitive just on the economics, not only of our military side, but also of our commercial economy?
Well, I'd say the one who has created most of the inflation, I would say, is Vladimir Putin. Because the war in Ukraine had an impact. If you look at the energy price in Germany, if you look at the inflation in the UK, if you look at the price of wheat, I mean, when you touch on two things, which is food and energy, that's kind of the perfect storm.
Yeah.
And I would say, you know, the inflation we're all paying, by the way, citizens in our economies are all paying for that level of inflation. When you're looking at the number of X in terms of the cost of energy in Germany, I was just in the UK recently. I think the price of energy bills for most folks down there is like twice as it used to be. And we've seen in Canada the price of food and everything. So let's be cognizant that one of the generator of that inflation has been the war that Vladimir Putin has inflicted on the people of Ukraine. To your point, I think that's why it's so relevant that we are here together, because one of the best protection against inflation, I mean, you know, we were looking at stats recently, and I say the inflation has two prongs. You know, it's both supply generated and demand driven. And I think that you could say it's maybe 50-50, but the supply side of it is very relevant, because you might increase interest rate, that may play with demand, but the supply thing is what we can do in order to have more efficient supply chain. To your point, when you started, Chris, you say, are you not concerned about, for example, semiconductors in Taiwan? Well, one way to ensure ourselves, again, potential disruption is to onshore these type of things. And you heard me talking about that in Washington last time. And yes, it made a bit of headline. And what I was saying is that when it comes to critical supply chain, yes, we're going to still be doing importing and exporting with China. But when it comes to critical supply chain, I think we would be well advised when it comes to critical minerals, when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to cutting edge technology like AI and quantum, for example, to be more resilient. And I think that is the best insurance policy against future inflation and that, because we're seeing today that when you have the cost of energy rising in one of our key partners, let's say in Germany, for example, this has a rippling effect, because a lot of the equipment that is used in factories in North America comes from Germany. So, you know, you have all these pressure in the system. So for me, more resilient supply chain, which is exactly what we brought to Washington this week, is one way to ensure against that. And I think that, I think also the CEOs we're talking about realize the benefit of that, because like I said, you make the wrong investment today, it can be very, very costly. So there's something to be said when you're very stable and predictable in a very challenging world. And I think we can lead in terms of these critical supply. And I would say, and I'll stop there, but the other, if I may use, challenge or war that you may see is on norms and standards. We really need to up our game to make sure that we define the norms and standards for the future, and work very closely with our American allies, because that's going to be defining in these key technologies that we're going to be needing for generations to come.
Can I just say norms and standards is the lingo of law professors.
Really, I love that. You know, I didn't.
And it is, you frequently refer to it as soft law. And I have written a bunch of stuff on the importance of soft law in terms of international behavior. So,
Well, I
good
love
job.
it. I should have read your. No,
Good
maybe
job.
I'll have a book. You know, after this talk. You know.
We can co-author something. How about that?
Hey, you see, Chris, what you're generating. You know, it's
Clearly,
like, yeah.
clearly. The world will be so happy to have more academic writing. I think that'll be great.
Segue into politics.
So I have another question for you, and one of the things that's been happening at Wilson, we've been very fortunate. A man named Sadek Waba, who's one of President Biden's infrastructure advisors, has created for us the Waba Institute on Strategic Competition. And the underlying principle of this is that to win a long, great power rivalry, you have to make sure that you are being strategic with the use of industrial policy, the building of infrastructure. And if you create a system in which your allies, you're robbing from your allies to create more jobs at home, you'll lose your allies. It has to be mutual benefit. And I know, being Canadian, you probably would be too polite to complain about this here, but I wanted to put this out to you. We've seen some things coming from Congress in terms of incentives and subsidies for particular activity, which is activity we need. But what about that Buy American piece? And is there a message here, even though I know you deliver it politely, about the value of not being so nationalistic that we end up undermining the Canadian recovery as well?
Well, I'll just start and then, of course, hand it over to François-Philippe because this is one of his main files. But our relationship with the United States is so close in terms of economic resiliency and supply chain interaction that I have confidence in the ability of the American representatives, Congress people I've spoken with, to recognize the importance and perhaps the uniqueness of Canada in a broader discussion about Buy America. So, for example, in the defense area, in terms of Canadian defense suppliers, as well as in the EV area, we have seen a Congress examine those particular areas and say, yeah, Canada's different. Canada's actually integral to American productivity, and we've been able to, receive different type of treatment, in fact, exemptions from the broader Buy America strategy. So again, I don't think it's just François-Philippe and I here in the United States talking about the importance of supply chain resiliency and interaction from an economic and defense standpoint on both sides of the border. I think it is well understood that our economic interdependence has to continue to be supported and to be robust. François-Philippe?
Yeah, well, I would say oftentimes, Chris, when I meet folks here in Washington, I remind them that a decision on one side of the border will always have impact on both sides of the border. And that the best way to preserve jobs in America, the best way for us to innovate, the best way to sell more to the world is to work together. The integrated nature of our supply chain dictates that. When you talk to CEOs, they'd say, you guys can say, there's a political discourse on both sides of the border, but when it comes to the actual implementation and the reality, I mean, we saw it when it came to vaccine. You look at a vaccine, you have what? I remember in the Pfizer, I was minister at the time of foreign affairs. I think there's 62 components in the Pfizer vaccines. So you need that fluidity in the supply chain because otherwise you can't deliver the vaccines that you needed at the time. So for me, I think that, like I said, you always have to think as Canada in a different way, perhaps than some of our partners, because the way our supply chain work, for example, let's take in the EV vehicle. The fact that we're going to have like a battery ecosystem on both sides of the border is a good thing because the factory in the north will depend mostly on some of the battery manufacturing capacity in Canada in the northern states. But it's sometimes forgotten, and that's an example. The cars that are manufactured in the northern states sometimes would cross the border 5 to 6 times before they go to a customer in the U.S. So these things are a reality. So I've never seen, for me, a competition between our two countries because for me, the big prize, as I always say, how can we innovate more together? Think about AI, think about quantum, think about cyber. The amount of investment we need to make to win is something that we need to do together. And I would add few allies with us in that. Then you say we need to manufacture more together, to the point of President, but I agree with that. That's why we need to onshore that, but there's going to be pieces on both sides. My example of semiconductor is telling. You want to win, you want to have more resiliency. Well, we need, if you increase your production of semiconductor, we need to increase our production of testing and packaging in Canada. And the same thing that we're going to be doing now in aerospace and defense, because that is the way to ensure prosperity on both sides. And I think there's a uniqueness in the relationship between Canada and the United States that even in my former role that you can't really find anywhere in the world. Even if I was to look in Europe or elsewhere, that interconnectivity, the fact that we always say we're friends, allies, and partners, that's very meaningful. And in a world which I think trade agreements are not going to come by very often, you have to realize Canada is the only G7 country with a free trade agreement with all the other G7 nations. So it serves sometimes U.S. companies because they say, Minister, we're going to have plants on both sides, but we use our Canadian plants, for example, to sell in Europe. So it's mutually beneficial. That's my point, is when I hear that, I say, let's think more on a continental base, because that's the best way to preserve jobs, to create jobs, and to win. At a time where you started that, Chris, that, you know, the challenge, whether it's geopolitics, the challenge, whether it's norms and standard, the challenge in terms of the investment needed to win, to make sure that we are relevant, that we ensure prosperity, the way to win is to do that together.
And I think the key word is interdependency. So I already gave the example of the 31 aircraft that comprises the global fleet of the Lockheed Martin F-35s. Another example is when I was procurement minister, the N95 masks that were being produced by 3M. And you'll recall that there was a time that, you know, we weren't sure if these N95s were going to actually be able to arrive in Canada, despite the fact that we had a contract for those masks. And what was quickly recognized, and why the masks did ultimately flow to Canada as required under contract, is that there are raw materials in those masks that derive from Canada. There are American healthcare workers that are coming across the border every day to work, even during COVID, in Canada. So it's so intricate, the relationship.
Yep.
So closely intertwined across a number of sectors, from a raw materials standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint, and from a human resource standpoint in terms of workers, that it really doesn't make sense to disentangle that relationship across those sectors. And it doesn't make sense to treat Canada in a way that other countries would be treated, because of the fact that we do $2 billion worth of trade with the United States every single day.
Well, we should not take it for granted. And I think that's why I thank you, Chris, and the Wilson Center and everyone which is here this morning. Let's not take that for granted, because that is really key for our prosperity for generations to come. It's easy for us to say it now, but I think in the world where you know, the world is watching in many ways, I think let's not take that for granted. I think the director said at the beginning, we're so close that we kind of, it's family. So we take kind of each other for granted. But that integration that Minister Anand was talking is key to win in the economy of the 21st century. We're living to the greatest transitions ever, the green transition and the digital transformation. And the way to win is to work together in that, because we have industries on both sides. So my point is that that's exactly why we're here, because it might be something intuitive when you're talking at the Wilson Center, but we need to make sure that workers, that unions, that everywhere around North America understand that the best way for us to win is to win together.
Absolutely. Now, we have a very distinguished audience, and sadly, not a lot of time for questions, but I'd like to invite questions from the audience. If we have two very nice, superb interns, if I may say. They're great with microphones. So if you could signal to one of them, we could take maybe a question or two from the audience before we wrap.
We can do it in French or in English,
That's
or even
also fine.
Italian if you want, and maybe other languages. You know, we're Canadian.
Any brave souls? Yeah, there we are. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much both for being here and for sharing your thoughts. My name is James Colligan. I'm with Beacon Global Strategies, a national security consulting firm here in D.C. Monsieur le Ministre, cette question est pour vous. You mentioned continental shoring, which I thought was a fascinating framing. How do you think that can apply to digital policy beyond semiconductors and other items, as in, I've seen press reports about some bills, for example, in Canada that people like USTR Thai and the embassy and the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa have expressed concerns about. So how can we apply your framing of continental shoring to a digital policy realm beyond essential supply chain issues in the tech space?
D'abord, merci pour la question. C'est un plaisir. Je vais faire une partie en français, but I think for most of the audience, I'll switch. Mais je suis content de vous répondre évidemment en français, comme vous pouvez imaginer. I'd say I'll give you a very practical example. Yesterday, Minister Anand and I were with our colleagues of the agency, the Civilian Agency on Cybersecurity. and to your point about the digital world. And we were brainstorming as to what I'm always trying to find ways we could do more together. You know, I reached out to the FTC chairwoman, the same thing with the FCC, because, for example, I'll give you, when we had the hurricane and we had outage, for example, on our networks, I said, you know, we should be working together because the hurricane comes on your coast and eventually to our coast. Is there a way we can push equipment one side of the border, for example? I saw the Federal Trade Commission, for example, in terms of competition to bring price down, and we've seen in the food industry and the container industry. And it goes to the point of Minister Anand. I often say, as minister, people are very sometimes focused on legal power, and I like to use soft power, where, you know, our voice matter when we speak for people and saying, you know what, we found this to be disturbing, and I want to do more with our U.S. friends. So I'll give you a very practical example. So yesterday we were saying, what could we do, for example, on cybersecurity, you know, and cyber hygiene, and how we could do it, and say, why don't we come, for example, with a set of guiding principles that we could suggest to companies on both sides of the border? Because one thing which is costly to business that we hear very often is the fact of regulatory framework that are different from Canada and the United States when you operate a business on a continental basis, let alone you have 50 states, 13 jurisdictions in Canada. And to the point that we can think about these things, even voluntary codes of practice, I think that would go a long way in order to improve productivity and to address some of the issues that you've said in the digital world, where these code of conduct or voluntary guiding principle or code of practice, I think this is somehow what I'm thinking, because regulation can bring you so far, but I think when you get the buy-in from the business actors, from people, I think we can achieve a lot together. And that's a very practical example that we're talking just yesterday.
And just to build on that, so in my previous life, in doing research, empirical research on firms' gravitation to these types of guidelines and principles, I was able to show that firms do voluntarily adopt guidelines because of their view, at least in part, that they don't want to be subject to additional regulatory environment and regulatory, I would say, frameworks. And so there is an incentive, in other words, for firms to adopt voluntary guidelines. I was looking at Canadian firms' voluntary adoption of Sarbanes-Oxley type measures in Canada, despite the fact we didn't have Sarbanes-Oxley. So that just goes to show you that in other sectors also, there is an incentive for firms to adopt these voluntary guidelines. So one of the ideas that François-Philippe and I had, that we will be working on in the Canadian context now, is coming out with that for not just the 300 largest companies on the TSX, but for small and medium-sized enterprises also, who also need to ensure that their cyber security is top of mind.
Absolutely. We have a question here in the front.
Oh, my good friend.
Yes, Nelson Cunningham. Oh, and we'll come around if we have the time. Here in the yellow tie.
How can I say no to Nelson? I don't know. Known him for so long.
It's a pleasure to see you in so many roles. We first met in the context of the Banff Forum up in Canada, which is a fabulous forum that brings together Canadians from all over the country, and occasionally they invite a friendly American up to try to explain America to them, and I've failed multiple times.
Well, we keep inviting you anyway.
Thank you. It's because you're too polite. My question has to do with really the definition of North America. It's easy in the context of trade to say, well, we should, yes, here at home, continental shoring, Canada, the U.S., Mexico. But a stickler will point out that North America actually runs down all the way through Central America. And then despite the jungles of the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia, we now have 10,000s of South American refugees every month going through that jungle. And yesterday it was reported that tens of thousands of those are now reaching Canada and crossing up near Lake Champlain into Quebec because of the benefits that Quebec offers to refugees. So when you think of North America, do you stop at Mexico? Or is there a thought that perhaps helping economic security in Central America and South America could also be good for Canada, just as we believe it would be good for us?
Well, as a former, I think the first time we met, now I was not yet minister, but I started as Minister of International Trade. That was my first job, and I'm one who believes that you need to create the opportunities in these countries. That's why when we were with talking about the Pacific Alliance or Mercosur, making sure that we could provide a framework for investments to go both ways. And to your point, I think that we need to do more with respect to creating opportunities on a continental base. Sometimes I'll tell you something, I was really sometimes shocked when in my previous role when I was saying, you see blocks which align a bit more, and oftentimes thought, we should really align more with our colleagues in South America and Central America. I mean, Canada, if you look at the Caribbean, CARICOM, for example, we the Second World War, I mean, I remember, I think Canadian ships were the one resupplying all the Caribbeans. I mean, we have an historical role to bring our colleagues in the CARICOM and certainly have that level of influence, which certainly would be needed at a time. And you're not without knowing that other states are trying to come in South America, in Central America, in the Caribbean. And I think that's probably for us in the United States to really think about, what the opportunities we create here, how can we extend them as well, and how can they be part of this big economic bloc, that we've been trying to create for a long time, this north-south bloc between North America down to Central America to South America. The two trade agreements are helping. Do we need to do more? Definitely, because I think, and I'll go there, if you think about critical minerals, I mean, we all know that there's a number of down there, and there's very interesting markets. That's why Canada has always been, as a nation of 38 million people, we've always been prone to trade agreements. And today, like I said, when I talk about Canada, and I leave it there, I never say come in Canada because we have a market of 38 million people. But I say when you come to Canada, you have preferential market access to 1.5 billion consumers in the world. And that is a real distinguishing factor. So how do we... I think it starts at home, to be honest. We need to figure out that between our friends in the United States, Canada, and then Mexico, and then see what we can do, and perhaps making sure that we have more alignment. I remember talking about standards and norms that Minister Anand knows well. How can we be together in these international fora to make sure that we think more on a continental basis, if you want, down to Central America and South America in terms of who do we want to put to govern, for example, these governing bodies on standards and norms. And I think our interests are very aligned, but there's more to be done in that front, definitely.
And Minister Anand, can I pivot that a little bit to you? Because one of the other things that's been in the news this week is Haiti. And Canada's been providing armored personnel carriers and some overflight. Is that something that you intend to continue? I know trying to support the Haitians, it's very tough on the ground there.
So, the solutions on Haiti have to be Haitian-led.
Absolutely.
And we're very cognizant of the importance of listening and learning and ensuring that whatever aid we put on the table is going to be useful. So, as you mentioned, transporting armored vehicles, which we've been doing over the past number of months, the overflight of the CP-140 Aurora recently, as well as ensuring that we have a continuous flow of information from Haiti about what is happening on the ground so we can better inform our choices about potential aid. And so from that perspective, our ambassador to the UN, Bob Bray, has been visiting in Haiti, has been reporting back to the Canadian government to ensure that we are doing what is useful for Haiti. But it is an extremely complex situation. We have been on the ground in previous instantiations of need. But again, we're being very cautious, and we want to make sure that we are cooperating with, for example, CARICOM, and from that perspective, our Prime Minister is very engaged on this file also.
Well, it's a great way to end today's discussion because it really focuses on how Canada steps up and is an ally, not just on the bilateral, but on the global scene, and not just in the high-profile files like Ukraine and China, but on the really important files here in the Western Hemisphere. So, ministers, thank you very, very much for coming and sharing all this with us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Back again.
Thank you very much.